This episode of Tales from the Backlog is brought to you by the patrons of the Tube Podcast Network. Some personal heroes of mine like Chris Nelson, the Top 3 Podcast crew, Zolgeek, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Nick Ficori, Jill, Soccer, ZNA, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt aka Stormageddon, JD, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Rob Shack, Brian Skirsha, Randall, and many more have all gone to patreon.com/realdavejackson to kick me a few bucks and help support the show. In return for these generous donations, these fine folks are getting some bonus episodes of Tales from the Backlog, the ability to vote in polls for what games I do on the show, and much more. At the $5 tier, I also do a bonus retro gaming show called Tales from the Way Backlog, and the game of the month on that show is Mega Man 2. Next month will be Zombies Ate My Neighbors, so if any of that sounds cool to you, head on over to patreon.com/realdavejackson. Any and all support is always appreciated, but the power of flight only lasts for 5 minutes, so we gotta get on with Kid Icarus Uprising. Let's go. Hello everybody, my name is Dave Jackson, and you're listening to Tales from the Backlog. This is a video games review podcast where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, play it, and discuss. My guest today is a friend of the show, returning for, I lost count, many-time guest of the show, host of the YouTube channel TripleSMoon and Warrior of Sunlight. Moon, welcome back on the show.
Hey Dave, thanks for having me on again. I believe this is time number 4, but even I'm not particularly confident in that.
I think so. We did Death's Gambit, we did Bloodborne, we did the Emergent Gameplay episode. Yeah, number 4. So, yeah, good to have you back on the show to talk about our game today, which is Kid Icarus Uprising. But before we get into Kid Icarus, I want to give you the chance, like always, to talk about your YouTube channel at the top of the show. What is going on over at TripleSMoon on YouTube these days?
Thank you. As Dave mentioned, I do host a YouTube channel called TripleSMoon, spelled like it sounds. I basically play action games usually, or platformers, etc., at kind of a challenge run capacity. And I kind of like commentate through the games in what I hope is a newbie-friendly manner, with the idea being to show people that playing like hard video games or video games in, a hard way isn't quite as inaccessible as they think it is. So, I do make some good content over there. I post some bonus stuff. I do have a Patreon, Twitter, Blue Sky, Discord, all under the same handle, TripleSMoon. You're welcome to check me out there if you wish. Tell me that Dave sent you if you do.
Yeah, get some of that referral kickback coming my way. It's a good one-stop shop for like action game stuff. And when I think Moon, I think Bayonetta, I think Metal Gear Rising, some Metroidvania stuff in there too. It's action game. It's drilling deep into the mechanics of it, and yeah, showing people that like playing these games and like getting the high scores or playing on high difficulties is doable. You just have to understand, and that's what you're there to do, is help people understand what's going on when you are at that level, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like, teach a man to fish type thing. Right. Like I don't think I would not call myself an expert on, I'm going to say, most of the games that I put on that channel. Mm-hmm. But what I try to do is like bring out the attitude, the kind of like the attitude of learning and just kind of like workshopping with a game. Like, the stuff like, labbing or workshopping, those are like terms you mostly associate with like, like fighting games or, Fortnite or, online, competitive games, right? But I think it can apply to like, more like single player stuff too, because there's a lot to dig into with a lot of these games that I think makes them really enriching experiences.
Yeah. I was thinking, give a man a pure platinum medal, and he'll get a pure platinum medal one time. Teach a man to witch time air juggle and some shit, and
Yeah,
pure
some
platinum
shit.
medals for the rest of their life. Yeah. So good to have you on the show. And the game we're talking about today is one of these games that I feel like if screen capturing from 3DS wasn't a fucking nightmare, might be something that you could do on the channel. Kid Icarus Uprising. Kid Icarus Uprising is a third-person shooter/action game developed by Project Sora and published by Nintendo for the 3DS in 2012. And if you have not played Kid Icarus Uprising, the way the spoiler policy works is the same as every episode of this show. We are going to avoid spoiling the story. We're going to avoid talking shop to the extent that someone who has never played will be completely lost. We'll save all that stuff for the spoiler section. Check down in the show notes. There will be a timestamp for when those spoilers begin. So if you want to tap out, that will be the time. So if someone has not played Kid Icarus Uprising, we have some elevator pitches for all of you. I wrote this is half rail shooter, half 3D action game, and I hope you got the extra stand peripheral. Moon, what would you say?
I would say quarter rail shooter, 3/4 3D action game. And if you're in the very large market of people who like both high octane risk reward action experiences and tendinitis, the market is finally catering to you. Like This very large market is finally catering to your taste. I'm very happy for you.
Yeah, all those people in the Venn diagram who really wish that a game would give them a really deep action experience and also irreparably damage their wrists and hands. The Venn diagram's overlapping, finally.
It's for people who want to be like Sakurai himself. Remember when he was developing Smash 4, he went so hard on it that he literally like injured his wrist for a time. And, if you're someone who's a Sakurai stan as much as I am, and you want to, see more of his mind, you can do to your hands what he did to his, and you'll understand his dark, twisted method.
It's exactly. I was going to say it's like method acting, but for gaming. It's method gaming. So this game took me 10 hours to beat. I played it on 3DS on the original hardware. I want to just point out when saying that it's 10 hours, I think that the pacing in this game is really, really good. It's made up of chapters, and each chapter is about 15 to 30 minutes long. So as a kind of a handheld game, it is a really ideal game for like a pick up and play type of style.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Pretty good pacing. I think I timed my recent playthrough. It was about maybe like 15 hours, but I did also make sure to put a lot of TLC into some of the stuff you do between missions as well, which probably made my time a bit longer than it would be if you were just kind of like casually playing through the whole game.
Gotcha. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Those absolute sicko things to do in between the chapters. We'll talk about that in a bit. Let's talk about our histories with Kid Icarus, the series, and with this game in particular. Moon, I'll kick it to you first. When did you first play this game? Did you play the original Kid Icarus? How did you first hear about this?
I think my history with the series is what is probably going to be most people's, where I heard about my first exposure to Kid Icarus Uprising was in Super Smash Brothers, and not necessarily in Super Smash Brothers Brawl, which is when Pit was introduced, but I believe Super Smash Brothers Melee had a Pit trophy you could unlock. And, there are a whole lot of old games I think a lot of people discovered through, like, Super Smash Brothers, not just from the characters, but also, like, the trophies you could unlock and other references that were in them. And I was like, oh, so I knew Kid Icarus was a thing, even though I never played it. I saw Pit in Super Smash Brothers Brawl. So when I heard that Sakurai was bringing back Pit for a new game using the updated design that, he, used in Smash Brothers, was he completely redesigned Pit and Palutena for that game. That's what I was just really excited, because I was like the world's biggest Masahiro Sakurai stan in the world at the time. Like, I was one of those like insufferable people who would like complain about tripping in Brawl and how Melee was better, simultaneously just hating this developer, but also thinking he's like the coolest thing in the world, right? And I played it at launch. I loved it. I put my GPA in jeopardy because that was my spring semester in my freshman year, and I was going to the library to study, and I would just be sitting there playing Kid Icarus Uprising for hours instead.
Fantastic. Everyone damages their GPA in their own ways when they're in college. Mine was playing Oblivion basically all the time. So Kid Icarus, Oblivion.
What's the difference?
Yeah. Like you, I had never heard of the Kid Icarus. I hesitate to say franchise, but like I'd never heard of Kid Icarus before I saw Pit in Super Smash Brothers. Now that you mention it, it probably was one of the trophies in Melee because I don't remember if we ended up getting all the trophies back then, but we got a lot of them. And I do remember looking at those trophies, and there's a lot of characters where you're like, whoa, who the fuck is this? This looks cool. So maybe you see that character later and you play that game. Not really for me, though, with this one, because I didn't have a 3DS until a couple of years ago when I picked one up at an electronics market in Korea. And Kid Icarus was, I bought it pre-hacked at the market. I think it was already on the 3DS, and it was just kind of sitting there for a long time. But through talking with you, as we do in the Discord servers that we share and stuff, you talk about this game a fair bit, and it kind of put it more on my radar until we decided that, like, hey, I'll play it, and we'll do an episode of the show about it. So that's really what gave me the push to play it. Without you talking about it, I'm not sure that I would have prioritized it.
Well, I'm happy to have that kind of bad influence. I will continue to have a bad influence on you going forward, I promise you.
Yeah, I salute you. And to get into some kind of quick opening thoughts here about Kid Icarus Uprising, this is a really interesting game for me to like kind of view holistically, like at the top of the show here. I think this game is really good, but I hate it on the 3DS. Like, this is a game that I'm very confident in saying, if they port this to the Switch or some other system in the future, it will be really good, really fun to play. The fact that it's on the 3DS with a very special control scheme made for the 3DS, I could not do it. And I beat the game and everything, but I beat it on like one of the easiest difficulties, not because I didn't like want the challenge, but because I literally could not play on the higher difficulties. So it's an interesting thing at the top of the show. I'll just say that I like the design of a lot of what's going on. I like the combat system. I can see where the depth in it is. I just could not engage with it. We'll dig into that a little bit more. How about you?
It's one of my favorite games of all time. I'm pretty sure for a good year or two after it came out, I considered it my favorite game of all time. It's definitely my favorite 3DS game, looking back. It's like, for the reasons you said, you just demonstrated, it's a very, very, very tricky recommendation because, as we'll get into a little bit later, like the control scheme asks a lot of the player on like a literal physical comfort level that's pretty unique compared to most games. Like, when you hear like a weird control scheme, I feel like most people think of something like I don't know, like Metroid Prime or Resident Evil 4, games that might be tough to control because that people might think are initially tough to control because they have like old fashioned, like, layouts, like single stick movement and aiming and stuff. But you can pick up a GameCube controller and feel comfortable. Like a GameCube controller is still going to be comfortable to hold today. Yeah. Whereas with Kid Icarus Uprising, there's stuff going on with the controls that are legit, like, depending on like the size of your hand and like your hand strength and so on and so forth, like you might literally be like, ouch, this hurts to play.
Yeah.
And who the hell knows if anyone's going to be able to get over that. But like, it depends on the person. But like, aside from that, because, it's a game that literally like filters you in that way, I guess, if you can come to grips with it, and I feel like maybe most people could, it just kind of like depends on, it kind of depends on both your tolerance and how much you can physically tolerate. Like, it's one of the most satisfying and deep action experiences I've ever had in my life. And it's got fantastic presentation. Like, I'm starting to sound like, what's her name with, brilliant, talented Never the same, never done before. Lady Gaga, whoever it was, I forget who said that. Like, so I don't want to love fest too much, but I love this game. I think it's fantastic.
Okay, and we're going to take a little bit of a music break here. When we come back, we're going to set up the story for Kid Icarus Uprising. So in Kid Icarus Uprising, you play as Pit, who is, as far as I know, the main character of the original game too. Actually, he is, because this game kind of picks up a little bit later from the original game, I think. Is that true?
Yes. There are 3 games. All of them star Pit. The second game was, I believe, America and Europe only. Okay. So this game actually doesn't reference it at all because Japanese players wouldn't get those references. It mostly just references the first game. But yeah, canonically, Uprising takes place in real time, 25 years after the events of the first game, which is also,
Gotcha.
25 years between when the games came out.
Right. So you play as Pit. Pit is an angel in the service of the goddess of sunlight, Palutena. If you played Super Smash Bros., you'll recognize the name Palutena as well, which is where I first heard that. At the beginning of the game, the goddess of darkness, Medusa, reawakens after decades gone. Pit is sent out by Palutena to destroy her. So this is taking place in this like Greek mythology setting here, with these gods and goddesses, with a lot of some other more familiar Greek gods like Hades and stuff like that as you're playing through. So this is the initial story setup for what goes on in the game. I think that this game has a story with some like interesting twists and turns. It's not a story that I'm going to like remember or really carry anything with me from. It's not like an emotionally affecting story, but it is kind of like a fun amusement park ride in a way, just going through cool locations and, oh, look, there's that Greek god that I've heard about before and stuff like that,
It very much follows like the rules of game design that were very popular at the time, where like, games were in very large part, almost to a fault, which Kid Icarus avoids, which Uprising avoids, of like kind of like making it like spectacular more than anything else, with just, big bombastic presentation and crazy amusement park ride stuff. And so it's because it's very much part of that era. It has a lot of that to the pacing and progression of the game. And, it's very interesting to kind of like notice that going back to it after 11 years since its release. God, it's been so long. But like 11 years after its release to kind of realize like, oh yeah, this was a game of the, 7th generation. This was like a game coming out at the same time as, games like, Bayonetta or Halo Reach or, whatever Call of Duty came out, or Azura's Wrath, things like that.
Yeah. It is a fun, like I said, amusement park ride through lots of like really cool looking locations. That's one of the main things I'll remember from like the things that going on in the story is all the interesting locations that you go to, from, temple landscapes and going into literally outer space and other dimensions and stuff like that. It's a fun ride. Pit himself is kind of an interesting character in the way that, like, playing in Super Smash Bros. As Pit, I really got no sense of Pit's personality at all from Smash. So it was unexpected, I'll say. Pit is not like a really traditional like hero type. He feels a lot younger and a lot more naive and kind of like a puppy following along, because Palutena is like leading these missions, but Pit is the one going out and flying and fighting and stuff. But he's very much not like the head person at all. He's in the service of Palutena. And because of that, he's just kind of along for the ride. Like, you need me to go here and kill these things? Let's go. Let's do it. I am a puppy.
Yeah, Pit is pretty interesting. Like, I do find it interesting. In the notes, you described him as like a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I know you probably just guessed that, but literally,
is he actually 12?
Well, it's very much like kind of immortal, like anime stuff where it's like, oh, these characters are all thousands of years old, but canonically, Pit is in the body of a 12-year-old boy. Palutena is like in her 20s, things like that. But even though these gods are like, probably thousands of years old, and even though Pit's not a god, he is, kind of like, immortal in his own way. Like, it's literally baked into the story, like Dark Souls, that when you die, you come back or whatever. So, but the thing about Pit that I find interesting is that even though he's not strictly human, he is kind of playing like the role of like the hapless mortal in Greek myths. Like he is kind of like in a way, kind of like the everyman who's dealing with all of these gods and all these fantastical, divine, and supernatural forces. And, they're very much all out of his league, like in a way, even though he's definitely even though the one thing that allows him to survive that makes him exceptional is that he can fight. And like so much of that is specifically because of Palutena's intervention, because, we'll talk about this later, but, Palutena lets him fly. Palutena brings him back from the dead, things like that.
Right. So he's capable in like melee combat, but like half of the game is flying, and he can't fly without Palutena. So Palutena is interesting too, and like their kind of partnership on these missions is kind of cool. She is characterized in like a very playful way, where she is kind of like joking around a lot of times. In this game. This game's like tone is more comedic than anything else, at least for most of the game. There's tons of puns and wordplay, jokes. I joked that he's a 12-year-old or a puppy, and some of the other characters treat him like that. They make fun of him and play little jokes on him from time to time as you go through the levels, because he very obviously like looks up to Palutena, and as such, he believes everything she says without fail. And so they play with that, and it gives the game a really playful tone that I didn't expect either.
One thing I really like is how even though this is a very loose take on Greek myth, I'm not going to pretend to be a scholar on Greek myth. Like, given an endless supply of prep time, I probably would have gone back and studied some Greek myth for some more heavy analysis of that part of the game, but it's very much kind of like a loose, like, kind of cocktail of like, here are a bunch of like miscellaneous ideas and characters from Greek myth. Now let's kind of like tell our own crazy story that just happens to involve these characters that just happen to have the same names, but not necessarily like you have Medusa, who is, to my knowledge, not a god in Greek myth, but suddenly she's like the god of evil, in this game, right? So like, they're just kind of like, it's almost kind of like this feels more reductive than I intend to, but it's just kind of like a word salad of like names and faces that are familiar from Greek myth, repurposed in their own way.
That's why that's why like the theme park ride analogy works for me, because you're just kind of, you turn the corner and there's another character with a name that you recognize there.
Yeah, and it's like, and the thing I find interesting, though, that I feel that they did kind of translate from Greek myth, is that literally all of the gods are the most petty assholes, including Palutena. And because Palutena is supposed to be, one of the good guys, and I don't mean that in kind of like a coy, subversive way. Like, she is one of the good guys. Like, the way they represent her still being a petty asshole is just making her an absolute troll. She's constantly like, just taking advantage of how naive Pit is, like literally like threatening his life with dumb jokes that freak him out, like in the middle of life or death situations, like just kind of like, just outright like manipulating or like kind of softly gaslighting him at times. Like she is a jerk, but they just kind of like, they're careful to portray it in a way so that you don't really like hate her either. Like she's amusing to watch. You can clearly see that she's a force of good, but she's just as much of a jerk as the rest of the gods in this game are.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a lot of banter back and forth as you go through these levels. On one hand, it's cool when you're going through like the flying missions, and we'll talk about like there's flying missions and then there's on foot missions, or like sections of missions in each type of gameplay mode. They talk to each other basically throughout entire levels. And this is interesting when you're like going through empty spots, but this game has that issue that I have personally sometimes where like I'm fighting for my life during some boss fight or really tough encounter with a bunch of enemies or something, and Pit and Palutena are talking to each other the whole time, and I can't make out what they're saying at all. So if it was important, I wouldn't get it. And sometimes it is important because they will, Palutena will like give you tips on how to fight an enemy or something like that. But if it's happening during like intense action, it doesn't even register. It's just noise, you know?
Yeah. One thing I will say about that is that I definitely felt that way a bit during this playthrough. Like when I was playing the game, like, you know, a decade ago, and I spent a lot of time with the game, I didn't really have that, especially because like the first time I played mostly on like lower difficulties I could manage. You know, I was able to kind of like pay attention and focus on the game at the same time. And then as I got more proficient at the game, you know, I was getting proficient enough that I could focus. But when you're like playing and if you're like, you're struggling with the game, like your brain runs out of RAM, as it were. You can only focus on so many different things at once. One thing you can do to help that the game doesn't really tell you is that by default, the subtitles are on the bottom screen. There's actually a tiny little arrow right below the subtitles where if you tap it on the touchscreen, it will actually move them to the top screen, which is, you know, the main screen you'll be looking at while you play, which might be helpful to some people. I did that and found it a bit helpful, but that is something that, you know, if you're struggling, you may like, you know, have some trouble missing. And because the dialogue, again, like I said, this was very much a 7th gen game released during 7th gen times. It very much has that kind of like tell, don't show method of teaching you, which it kind of avoids the pitfalls of like a lot of other games of that generation by not making you stop and have a little tutorial screen that kind of like brings the action to a halt because you are being taught things as you play. But if you're struggling to pay attention, that kind of, you know, brings about its own, you know, issues, right? Like if Palutena says, hey, this enemy can only be hit with melee shots when screen or whatever, and you miss that, then that might, you know, you might have a bit of a hard time there for a bit.
Yeah. And the way that it gives you those like tutorials while you're playing the game without interrupting you, I think is something that contributes to the pacing being really snappy. Because you're not stopping for them to talk for 5 minutes about what's going on in the story. All of that happens while you're playing the game. But it's just sometimes the action gets really hot. The action gets hot. The action gets
goes up.
Intense. And is intense better? Yeah. The action gets more frenetic, and then you just lose track of what they're talking about. I'm not sure that like I beat the game. So I don't think I missed out on like, you know, there's this one enemy with only one weakness and I couldn't pay attention to the tutorial, so I missed it. I don't think that happened. But for a lot of those, you know, action parts, I couldn't tell you what they were saying. So yeah, just something that happens. I will say that I think the voice acting for Pit and Palutena is really fun. And the voice acting for a lot of the side characters is also really fun, with the exception of a few too many characters that I felt like had the old school kind of flamboyant voice, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like Hades and a couple of, like, they're fun characters, but like, I think they dipped into that well too many times.
Isn't that a spoiler?
The fact that Hades is in the game, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Probably my favorite voice role in the game, by the way, but
yeah. It's not like I have an issue with that voice, but there's like a couple others that use a variation of that same voice.
Like
I just
Thanatos,
think they dipped in the well. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to point out that unless there's been some update that has changed this, Kid Icarus Uprising is the only, at least for English, the only English voice acting job under Nintendo's name that was done with union voice actors. Mm-hmm. And I'm not an expert on how voice acting works or how unions like affect the work process, but all I'm saying is this is Nintendo's only union voice acting performance, And it turned out real freaking good. Like, I legit think that, like, unless you want to gerrymander a little bit and count Bayonetta 2, which technically, you know, Nintendo owns, like, in part, like, I don't know how much they had to do with the voice acting there. I think Kid Icarus Uprising is the greatest English voice work that is under Nintendo's name. Like, it is genuinely a very good performance, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Like, everyone does a great job. And in my head, I'm running through other high-profile Nintendo games. Like, nope, bad voice acting. Nope, no voice acting. Nope, Mario barely talks. We're just running out of options here. But I agree.
Well, I mean, let's be real. Their only competition is Metroid Other M, and we all know how that went. So,
or like Breath of the Wild or something like that. But not really notable voice acting in that game. But yeah, it's good, and it lends to that playful kind of tone that the story has, and that the characters all have with each other, and good chemistry between the actors too.
Yeah, they had really good chemistry. I guess the last thing I want to say about this is, like, since you mentioned the humor earlier, is one thing I like is that the kind of humor that's on display, it feels like it could be seen as adjacent to or mistaken for, like, kind of like Whedon speak type humor. Like, because there are a lot of, like, you know, fourth wall breaks and just like characters trying to joke it up as much as possible, you know, every other line and stuff like that. Yeah. But I feel that there's a pretty smart, like, I don't know, if I knew Japanese, I would love to do a comparison of what, like, the Japanese voice tracks were like compared to the English ones, because they clearly had to, like, localize so much and, like, change so much to make this, like, hit for a Western audience in English. Like, it does not sound like I'm listening to, like, a straight, like, dub from Japanese to English. Like, it feels like custom made for, you know, English, at least in the English localization. And there's just so much smart comedic timing going on with the way the jokes are delivered. Like, they won't just, like, pay off jokes immediately. Like, there are literally jokes. Like, I guess since you already mentioned Hades, I can talk about this one. Like there's one joke in particular where I'm not going to try to explain a joke and make you laugh, but, like, just to give you an example, there's one bit in one chapter where Pit gets jumped by a mimic, basically, and Hades denies being the one who put it there. And they wait literally until, like, a chapter or two later for Hades to go, by the way, I confess, that was me last time, and everyone gets mad at him. And it's like, I feel like most other comedy writings of that style, they would have just, like, done that immediately. But no, they expected the audience to hold on to that information for a whole mission and then you know, paid it off the next one. And I think that made it way funnier. And there's a lot of examples of that, you know, throughout the game, where they just kind of, like, they hold their jokes and they cash them out later in a way that's pretty fun.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. It is a fun game. It has a fun tone. The jokes hit more often than not, I think. Yeah, it's a good time. This game also, I think, looks really good as far as 3DS games go. In playing 3DS games after the 3DS's, like, contemporary time, you know, I think the 3DS is like the little 3D console that could. A lot of 3D games on the 3DS look okay. They don't look great. It's mostly just the screen resolution is not very high at all. But this game, I think, despite having, you know, 3D design in low resolution, I think this game looks really good, and it's a testament to art direction and the types of locations that you're in, especially in the levels where you're flying, because they will take you to all kinds of cool places. You will, like, cinematically, like, fly through canyons and portals and all kinds of crazy shit. And all of those levels I thought looked really, really good. And of course, like, as far as information that you need to play the game. I also think that everything is recognizable that should be recognizable. Enemy weak spots and things like that stand out when they should. So yeah, it's a good looking game.
Yeah, and it's really genuinely one of the better looking 3DS games, I think. Like, yeah. It's kind of like we already knew this before, but now that Sakurai has his YouTube channel and he's just constantly like making videos where he explains his method, like he goes way too hard on making games look and run good. And I'm not going to be the guy who says like, oh, this is flawless. It ran at 30 FPS. I never had a drop. Everything was clear and perfect, blah, blah. But like, it really did look good. It really ran well. Yeah. It uses its assets smartly because a lot of the designs are pretty simplistic, but they stand out in ways that are pleasing. They manage to draw the eye in a interesting way so that you only focus on the stuff that looks really good. The 3D effect was pretty fantastic. I'm a weird like 3D believer on the 3DS. I use it almost religiously, but it was especially nice here when you're talking about like a 3D rail shooter and like one of the only like things that you could call a shooter on the system. Like at least in my estimation, because like, the original DS had tons and tons of shooters, but 3DS it didn't seem like it had as much. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I tried the 3D. Every 3DS game I play, I'll turn on the 3D for like a half hour just to see what it's like. I agree with you. The rail shooting sections with the 3D on looks cool. To the extent that I think any game can look cool with that 3D thing. I'm not a fan of it, but I do think this is the best game that I have played with that 3D, if that makes sense, even though I still didn't choose to play the rest of the game with it on. But I'll take your word for it that it continues to look cool. So all of the other 3D sickos like you can experience that if that's the way they want to do it. I want to point out that the monster designs that you're fighting are all really fucking weird and cool. Very rarely came up to a new monster and was like, yeah, I know exactly what that is. Everything is real weird and stands out. A lot of them have their own kind of move sets and stuff that you do need to learn. So having them all be super visually distinct is really helpful.
Yeah, and the other thing about the monster design is that because the 3DS has such a small screen, Sakurai kind of like emphasized making all the monsters big. Like, and it's crazy because you wouldn't really notice playing it. But like, you're playing a 3DS game and there are a whole bunch of monsters that look like they're sensible sizes, and that you can clearly see them and you can attack from far away or close up. But if you pay attention, like if you get up close even to like one of like the basic Goombas, like the little like floating eyeballs that I forgot the name of, like they're like 4 or 5 times pit size. Like you wouldn't notice because you rarely spend time right up in their face, but they like emphasize these big, bright, impossible to mistake monster designs that make it, a lot, easier for you to play and make out as we'll talk about later, but there are so many consolidations they made for the fact that, okay, this is a 3DS. It has certain weaknesses. We're asking the player to bring this effort, so we're going to make everything else as simple and easy and streamlined as possible. And like the way the monsters are designed, like so distinctly, is one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. The other half of what I think is like the strongest point of this game, other than gameplay that I couldn't access, like the hypothetical idea of gameplay for me, is that the music in this game is fantastic across the board. Basically every level I was like, shit, this is a bop. I love this. There are a couple of like Spanish guitar tracks that are just fucking incredible in this game. But then when they move away from that, and it does shift genre often, the real kind of bombastic cinematic stuff is really cool too. It's just a treat as far as music goes.
Yeah, the music, let me put it this way. The soundtrack to Kid Icarus Uprising was one of the earliest soundtracks that I went online to find like a low quality rip of straight from the system to download and put on my music library. Like I still have that rip album like on my YouTube Music nowadays. Like, that I have uploaded from back when it was still Google Music or whatever. Like it is a pretty good soundtrack. Like, I don't listen to it as much as I used to, but a lot of good bombastic tracks, a lot of like surprising changes in key. Like I'll talk more about it when we get to spoilers, because this one definitely is a spoiler, but there's one really, really good scene in particular in like chapter 18 where you get a certain reveal and like the music kind of like builds up in this crescendo. And it's really like dramatic and powerful in a way that simply wouldn't have been without that music track. Which is another thing they did, like during the air segments, is because they have basically a guaranteed set amount of time that they last, because, it's auto-scrolling, the music was specifically tuned so that it could, like, in a more cinematic fashion, they could perfectly predict where you were going to be at any given time, so they could make the music match what was going on in a way that hits even more than, they would in a typical video game, which is saying a lot, because video game music kicks ass, like.
Yeah. I was just checking because I forgot when I was doing my like prep for this episode, I forgot to look up who did the music. And now that I look at this list of names, I'm like, yeah, no shit, this music slaps. Listen to these names. Motoi Sakuraba, who did like the Dark Souls Golden Sun soundtracks, first name on the list. Yasunori Mitsuda, who is like a legend in video game composing. Yuzo Koshiro and Masafumi Takada. Takada, I had to look up what they did, but then I was like, oh, they did the soundtrack for God Hand. Of course, that soundtrack's incredible. So this is like an all-star music composition team here, and it makes a lot of sense. Music slaps.
Yeah, they knew what they were doing for sure. I remembered it was an all-star cast. I didn't remember any of the names besides Motoi Sakuraba, but that's a really, really good list of names.
Yeah. Yasunori Mitsuda famously... Chrono Trigger,
that's
Chrono
right,
Cross,
right.
Xenogears, and stuff like that. It's just an incredible resume for this team. Let's listen to a bit of that music and let's get into the gameplay of Kid Icarus Uprising. So, gameplay time. This is where Dave Talking Sugar is going to we're going down the roller coaster now. I mentioned at the top of the show, I really struggled with the gameplay in this, but I want to talk about the part that I enjoyed first before we get into the part I didn't enjoy. So, chapters in Kid Icarus Uprising are always, with the exception, I think, of one chapter, split into two modes. You do a rail shooting section, then you go down to the ground, and you have the on-ground, like, third-person action sections. And then there's a boss fight at the end. So, things that are consistent between the two is when you're playing, you use the left trigger to shoot. You always have a ranged attack, and you use the left thumbstick to move, whether you're moving around the screen during the rail shooter sections or literally controlling Pit on the ground. If you don't shoot for a second, because you'll be in especially in rail shooting, I just shoot all the time. Just hold the trigger down all the time. But if you don't, you'll build up a charge shot, and that charge shot will be more powerful. It has a homing quality. The reticule will change, so you'll know when it's ready. There's some enemies that can only be used, only be killed by those charge shots. So far we're off to a decent start. Although I will say right now, I hate the circle pad on the 3DS. I can't stand it. So that's during the rail shooting parts, I was fine. During the on-ground sections, that contributed to some frustration. I assume you're okay with it?
Yeah, this kind of goes in with the Moon's opinions on 3D on the 3DS as well. Like, I honestly like the circle pad a whole lot, and I honestly wish that the PlayStation Vita had two circle pads instead of two mini thumbsticks. Like, I think, like, when you get to a little tiny device like that with a tiny, like, control stick, I honestly think that little, like, analog slider is better than the little thumbstick, just because, like, I feel like I have more of a control over the range of motion as opposed to, like, like the little Vita, like the Vita. And I love the Vita. I'm not trying to slag off the Vita. It's one of my favorite handhelds. Like, the little thumbsticks, you have barely any travel when you're moving. So, But that's honestly just my preference. I've never felt like I was uncomfortable controlling the circle pad at all, personally.
Yeah, it's between this and playing Majora's Mask 3D, the circle pad, it might just be my 3DS is, used, it's old, it might be worn down, but I find it slippery. And also, I promise I don't have greasy like sausage hands when I'm playing video games or something, but it's just difficult. The other thing is the 3DS is too small for my hands, just straight up. If I'm playing a game that requires, action, it is too small. So it hurts my hands to play it. I need to buy a grip, but I am too lazy. So in these rail shooting sections, you're flying through the air. You're just kind of moving Pit around the screen to avoid projectiles. But that's all like the direct control you have over Pit. And you're using the stylus with your right hand to aim on the screen. So you may be thinking, okay, I'm using my left hand to hold the 3DS, hold the trigger, use the thumbstick, and I'm using a stylus to move a cursor around the touch screen. How am I holding this in my right hand? And the answer is you either get creative, like I did and like I know you did, Moon, or you use the stand that was sold with this game. I eventually found a way to hold it to curl my pinky under the 3DS on my right hand and hold it there. And then I could use the stylus and use my other hand. And it's not comfortable, I'll say that, but I made it work. But I think the fact that this game was sold with a peripheral to literally hold your 3DS tells me that even the team that made this was like, yeah, this is kind of fucked. Like we know it's kind of fucked. It's kind of fucked. Here's a stand to hold your 3DS.
It's funny you came up with that solution, but that's the exact solution I came to hold the 3DS. Because I think what happens, I think what causes a lot of the pain is like the idea of basically supporting the weight of the entire 3DS with the same exact hand that's also going to be hitting the analog stick and like the left trigger, which I can imagine gets uncomfortable after a while, especially if you're actively pressing down on it with the stylus. So, putting the pinky underneath and then kind of curling your hand over so that your stylus can reach it. Like that's a way to kind of keep the weight more evenly distributed, right? The stand is definitely like probably the most comfortable way to use it. All I can really say, like this isn't going to be good comfort to anyone, but it's like, I really don't have anything to say about the comfort beyond that, except that, I played a few chapters and I was fine after that. And like this recent playthrough, I did endeavor to go out of my way to use multiple different methods, like just so I could see how they feel. Like I played it in bed. I played it without the stand sitting up. I played it on the stand sitting at a desk. I found all of them to work pretty well. One thing I do want to point out that could help people, and especially might actually help Dave, especially with like, left hand, pain, is that there's a setting you can turn on that puts on auto fire. And what it'll do is that whenever you paint an enemy with your reticle, it'll automatically fire. And I've tried that. I played both. I ended up turning it off because, it took me a while to get used to it again since I haven't played in so long. But once I got used to it, I turned it off. I could use the L trigger as it is, but that is one thing at least you can try. Like I'm not saying any of this to like, kind of like defend the game and say, no, the controls are secretly comfortable, but like, I do want people who do try to play this to be aware of the options they do have, because it would be really sad if you play this game and you like it, but you literally couldn't keep playing it because you were uncomfortable, So
right,
yeah.
And when I talk about like how I couldn't meet the game at a place where it wanted me to, it wasn't because of this control scheme where you're doing the rail shooting and just aiming with the stylus. It was the ground combat sections where you aim with the stylus and control the camera with the stylus. I just could not get a grip on that throughout the entire game. And luckily, you get to choose what difficulty you play on. If people have played Super Smash Bros., you know this system where you can pick a difficulty between 0 and 9, and 9 being the hardest. I played on difficulty 2 the entire game, and I was dying consistently on difficulty 2. And every time I would beat a level, the game would be like, hey, you want to try difficulty 5? And I'd be like, no, I don't. And it's because the ground sections, which we'll dig into a little bit more, you are doing all of the things we talked about before, but now you're controlling a 3D camera with the stylus. And like, I want to give them props for simplifying a control scheme basically down to 3 inputs: the stick, the left trigger, and the stylus. But it just did not work for me. Just straight up.
Yeah. It shows like an interesting, kind of an interesting scenario because like they know that, the control scheme is, potentially, physically uncomfortable. But the thing that Sakurai is really good at is that he knows how to streamline controls in a way that basically crushes their simplicity as much as possible while also still allowing like depth of control and depth of player action. So like he does that. And it's more critical in this game than maybe any other game he's played just because of how physically uncomfortable it could be. Like without like if it was physically uncomfortable and like the control scheme was not like immediately super intuitive, then good night, man. Like that would just like, I feel like that would tank the game for way more people than it did if like they didn't make not the theory of the control scheme, but you get what I'm saying. Just like the raw design, regardless of physical comfort aspect of the control scheme, like as simple and intuitive as they did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess to elaborate on what Dave was talking about with controlling the camera, the way it works is that instead of like, if you think of like a shooter on the DS, like Call of Duty on the DS or Metroid Prime Hunters on the DS, where like you're moving around with the D-pad and you're using the stylus to kind of like drag the your viewpoint around, right? Kind of like, an approximation of what a shooter would be like on a console with the touchscreen replacing the, right stick, right? Sakurai has stated multiple times that he thinks it's really unwieldy. He thinks it's cumbersome. He does not think it allows for even remotely the level of control that you would need to kind of make shooters more interesting on the platform. So instead, what he does is that the touchscreen kind of follows an old IBM laptop trackpad rule, where you kind of like flick it and there's a little bit of inertia so that your reticle continues traveling after you let go. So you can tweak your sensitivity, but the way it works is that you're not necessarily supposed to always be, sometimes, but you're not necessarily always supposed to be like dragging the stylus across the touchscreen. You're supposed to flick it, which will make it spin kind of like a globe, and then you tap it again to kind of firmly stop it. And that kind of allows you to both like have fine-tuned aiming, but also if you need to turn around like 180 degrees immediately to face another enemy or whatever, you can do so very quickly. It's like, it kind of like puts it more in line with like, I guess, keyboard and mouse controls than it does with, controlling with a controller where the right stick kind of like drags the reticle along.
Yeah. I think that it's a really elegant idea for replicating a game mode that shouldn't work without 2 thumbsticks, right?
Yeah.
Because every single modern game that has a movable camera use the right thumbstick to control what that camera does. And so the idea to kind of flick and tap to give you like really precise control over the camera is a really good idea. And it's a credit to Sakurai for, again, refining all of these like pretty complex things down to 3 inputs. In practice, I think this is cumbersome and frankly bordered on unplayable at times, especially when you are traversing through levels on foot where you can fall off the edge and get hurt. When you're trying to like get around to the backside of an enemy and like run around and then spin the camera, I just couldn't do it. And this is in kind of like, because I don't want to dwell on the camera too long, but the camera contributed to the ground sections of this game being my least favorite control scheme of any game that I can remember playing recently. I really hated this.
Once again, I have the unhelpful response of, oh, well, I just didn't have a problem with it. I do want to agree with you though, on like the platform sections. Like, I don't think all of them were terrible, but I think anytime it asks you to navigate like really, it didn't happen tons of the time, but like whenever it did ask you to kind of like navigate like narrow, like precision platforming sections, I didn't think that was quite great. Not necessarily because of the touchscreen. I just think that the way Pit moves didn't really kind of like match the required precision to do that. Since he's more, since, you know, the movement scheme is designed more around like dashing all over the place as opposed to like precisely walking around, but it just led to a lot of frustrating pitfalls. Pun unintended, but intentionally left in.
Yeah. There are also sections where you're driving vehicles in this game, and they are, in my opinion, uniformly terrible because of
that was pretty slippery too. I wasn't a fan of how the camera worked for vehicles.
Yeah. Anyway, we've dwelled on the camera too long. Everyone knows how we feel about it at this point. So like we said, the game is gameplay sections are broken up into two types. The first part of every level, you are doing a rail shooting section. In the story, Pit can only fly for 5 minutes at a time because Palutena is literally giving him the power of flight, which is weird because this, as far as I know, the only story where angels can't fly on their own that I've experienced. And Palutena is a god. I'm not sure why she only gets 5 minutes, but hey, 5 minutes of flying. And you kind of timed this out. Most of these sections are literally 5 minutes long.
Yeah, like give or take like 10 seconds or so. Like I don't think I've ever seen one that exceeded 5 minutes exactly, because I would hit the timer the moment I hit the home screen. Probably about 30 seconds or so between that and actually starting the level. And then I'd look at the timer and it would be like, oh, it is like 5:14. This was almost exactly 5 minutes. Like, you know.
Yeah. And this is the part of the gameplay that I really liked. I like the rail shooting. It's not, well, I was playing on difficulty 2, but I did not have difficulty with this. Had I been able to separate rail shooter difficulty versus ground combat difficulty, I would have raised this up and tried a little bit more. But this is cool. It's just a nice breezy time. You're flying, you're shooting stuff. The scenery during these sections is always really cool. Like we said, temples, flying through space, flying inside of monsters sometimes, like very varied landscapes. And again, it's just simple, breezy, like arcadey fun during these sections.
One thing I will say about the rail sections that we already talked about the controls, but like one other thing that I think I'll say about the rail shooter sections that I think endear a lot more people to them is that even though they can still get really harrying and really difficult if you up the intensity, the rail shooting sections have absurdly simple, you know, controls overall and absurdly simple strategies. Like, that's not to say there aren't, like, you know, there isn't some depth to the decision you're making of how you handle enemies, but ultimately it does boil down to, and they tell you this in the beginning, is move in a circular pattern so you can avoid bullets, and and while you're doing that, also focus on aiming and shooting. And then, you know, you got a few other wrinkles aside from that. Like, there are certain enemies that can only be taken down with melee attacks, so you have to wait till they get close to you to hit the attack button. We'll talk about that later, but the melee and range attack still both use the same button. It just automatically switches depending on how far away you are.
Right. You
know, you have little special attacks. They're like these 2 meters that fill up, and whenever they're full, you tap the icon on the touchscreen and you kind of do a screen clearing attack, and, you know, it fills up based on the enemies you kill. But it's overall like very simple, even when it does get difficult, the way it works. And, you know, it's way more nakedly about the spectacle than the ground sections are.
Yeah. And then when you're done with those air sections, when your 5 minutes is up, you land, and you're going to go into one of the ground sections. You get a checkpoint in between these, which was very helpful for me. The ground sections, you kind of touched on there, bring melee combat into the mix, like into the forefront a lot of times, depending on how you want to play. I kind of hung back and used ranged as much as I could, but there are some enemies that have to be meleeed, some that are flying, you have to shoot them. The ground sections here, I already talked about, I hated playing these every time. I was like, oh man, my 5 minutes in the air are up, I have to do the ground sections. But I could quickly realize, like, there's a lot more depth to this combat system than you would expect based on, like, the depth that's apparent in the rail shooting sections, I think. And it's interesting thinking about this and thinking about Super Smash Brothers, which is Sakurai's other baby, Super Smash Brothers has a ton of depth in the amount of moves you can do with 2 attack buttons, basically 3 attack buttons. This kind of gave me that same feeling. Now, I could not engage with this because the camera was basically a boss fight the entire time I was playing. So I will kick it to you to kind of just give a little overview over like how deep this actually goes.
Okay, so first I just want to mention one small thing I forgot to mention about air combat. There's also for the rail shooters, there's also a air dodge. You basically just mash the control stick in 2 opposing directions real quickly. The reason I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to bring this up is because that actually is kind of finicky in my experience. I don't like doing it. Granted, if you're playing smartly, you'll probably never have to use it. But, if you are in a situation where you want to use it, sometimes it just doesn't respond well, in my experience.
Interesting.
And that can be kind of annoying. Like, it's kind of like you do like a barrel roll laterally in one direction. Like, it basically, if you're at a standstill, if you want to dodge right, you mash left and then immediately dodge right. And then Pit will kind of like do, and he'll just kind of like boost towards like the right or whatever. And same for any other direction. You can do it it doesn't have to be at cardinal directions either, but yeah, that is one other thing you can do in the rail sections. But for the ground sections, I told Dave this. I wrote my notes on this multiple times in an attempt to condense it as well as I could. And I'm definitely not going to go into super, super detail for fear that this would take hours, but I do want to just kind of like talk about like the basic fundamentals of how ground combat works because, and the way I've come up with is that you can divide the mechanics into the 3Ds and an S, or as I like to call it, 3DS. Sora can eat his heart out. I'm going to dream drop his distance over this. But basically the way it works is that, the basic controls from the rail combat are still there, except that you move. Instead of using the circle pad to kind of move around a screen, you're actually physically moving like you would in any other 3D game. And,
right.
And like Dave mentioned, there's a lot of Smash Brothers DNA here because the way you move faster is by smashing the circle pad in direction, holding it, much like how dashing works in Super Smash Brothers. Like, if you move the stick lightly, you'll just kind of walk, but if you smash it, you'll break out into a dash. And you can dodge. There are so many actions mapped to these few keys, and it sounds a lot more complex than it is, but you'd be amazed by how smartly the game knows what you're doing. Like, you also use the control stick to dodge, where basically if an enemy or an attack is about to hit you, if you just like mash the control stick in a direction, you'll kind of just dodge to the side. And then you have, of course, you attack enemies just by using the left trigger, or if you're an octopus, I guess you can set another button to that. But for most people, you're going to be using the left trigger, or if you're using the lefty control scheme, the right trigger. And that's how you attack. And it's got the same rules where like you fire shots, or you fire charge shots by not hitting the button and letting the reticle change. But the way you kind of combine these together is that there are a whole bunch of different interactions based on what you combine. So like if you dash and immediately hit the attack button, you won't do a regular shot. You'll do a dash attack where Pit will kind of like boost in a cardinal direction, whichever one you're holding, and you'll fire a volley of shots that have increased power and increased homing as well. And that's like the main way you do damage. They are much like smash attacks in Super Smash Brothers, where you just kind of like dash in any direction. Weapons will have modifiers that might make certain directions more powerful. We'll talk just a tiny bit about that later. And of course you can combine this with the charge shot, which will let you do exactly what it sounds. You dash and then do a charge shot while dashing in that direction. And the way melee attacks work, which I kind of mentioned this a little bit in the rail section, but when you get close enough to an enemy, attacking automatically makes you melee them instead of using ranged attacks. So you get up to an enemy, and it doesn't matter what weapon or type you do. So even if you have a bow and arrow, when you come up to an enemy, Pit will kind of like suddenly, twirl the bow like it's a baton and like, attack the enemy with it or whatever. And it's very, very, very basic action stuff. There's not like attack strings or whatever here. You just have like a basic 3-hit combo that you can use to knock enemies back, or, certain weapons have more or less. And, different enemies will incentivize whether you want to attack from a range or attack up close. Different weapon archetypes will have different strengths. I'm not going to go over all of them here, but, you got bows, you got clubs, you got claws, you've got cannons, like a whole bunch of different weapon archetypes that influence what's better or worse for you in what section.
Yeah, that's one thing that I wanted to kind of bring up also, is that part of the, I guess, variations or depth in the combat is that you'll be picking up different weapons all the time, and you'll want to switch them out, or at least try them out. I ended up switching out, bigger numbers between every mission, but the weapons all have different strengths and weaknesses, as far as this one will be really good at ranged but suck in melee, or vice versa, or this one's pretty balanced. And they feel different enough to play around with that you are kind of incentivized to experiment with different types of weapons on top of all of the different moves that you have when you're playing, There's
a real feeling of this is the kind of thing that gets discussed about with other action games or games like Bloodborne a whole lot, where each weapon feels like a character unto itself, because it's not it's not even necessarily just the strength or, strengths and weaknesses of your different attacks. It's also things like movement speed, like claws, for example. If you're using claws, those are inherently way faster for movement speed than, any other archetype is, just to make up one example. And then, clubs, meanwhile, will be very slow, but they'll be very powerful. And it sounds like it's basic stat changes, and in a way it is, but those stat changes mean so much when so much of what you do is based on your movement ability. Even for the dodge, I mentioned, you have a basic dodge, which by the way, you get a counterattack off doing that, and the game doesn't really tell you that except in a tooltip. If you pull up a dodge, it makes your charge attack charge up faster. So the ideal scenario would be you dodge an attack, your charge attack immediately fills up, and then you fire it to, get extra damage on, whatever it is that tried to kill you. You have a specialized version of the dodge where if you're close-ish to an enemy and you have your reticle aimed at them, mashing left or right will have you kind of dash around them. If I had to compare it to anything, it's kind of like a circle strafe, in a Zelda game, sort of. Except, way more dramatic. You're shooting almost 180 degrees around the enemy whenever you do that to, get more, damage. And what kind of, I'm definitely skipping some details here, but what really wraps all this together is you have stamina. And stamina governs everything I've mentioned that has to do with dodging or dashing above is governed by stamina. And it's not a visible stamina bar like in Dark Souls or something. It is an invisible stamina bar that behaves the same way. So if you look up next to your health bar, there'll be a little angel wing icon. And when your stamina starts to run low, the icon will start to sweat. And, also the character will sweat as well in case you're not looking up at that corner. So you'll know when you're running out of stamina. And you want to avoid running out of stamina completely, because when you run out of stamina completely, Pit enters this kind of helpless, exhausted state where he puts his hands on his knees and he's panting until he catches his breath. And while that's going on, you're completely helpless. Any enemy can get you. And there are some wrinkles to this because, when you stop doing stamina costing actions, the stamina will refill, but you can't see it. You have to kind of internalize how long it takes to refill your stamina, or also how much you want to worry about refilling it before you continue moving. Your dash attacks cost stamina. If you dash, there's a wrinkle to the way dashing works where when you first dash, you kind of get this burst of momentum that's faster than the rest of the dash that you settle into, which is, again, that's also in Super Smash Brothers. It's also in Mirror's Edge, believe it or not. Completely unrelated game. But what you can do is you can repeatedly mash the control stick in that direction, which is also from Smash Brothers. It's called foxtrotting, where you'll move twice as fast, but your stamina will empty twice as fast as well. And I could go on forever, but there are just so many little interactions between these individual mechanics where even though it's just a few of them, there's also so many different ways that you can, cause them to interact, which is, really interesting and adds to a whole lot of depth. I guess the only other things I'll mention beyond this is that the way levels work is that you have powers, which are kind of like these Tetris board buffs and abilities and attacks that you fill between battles that kind of like are shown on the touchscreen, and they're metered. You can only use them so many times between deaths or between stages. And, you can use that to kind of like refill your health or fire a mega laser or give you super armor, or some of them are solo mode only. Some of them are multiplayer only, but that's kind of like an extra wrinkle that you can. And by the way, power selection sucks. I want to call out the things I complain about with this game when they come up, because it's such a love fest otherwise. But the way power selection works is you have kind of like a little like grid on the touchscreen, and it's horizontally, it's however many powers you have, but vertically it's just one. So you only see 3 powers ever at once, and you have to scroll through them with the stylus. And if you try to select when you're in a power when you're in the middle of a harried fight, good night, man. It is so hard to select them without the touchscreen thinking that you're trying to drag different powers instead of using one, which can get really frustrating.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. So there's 25 chapters. I probably used one of those powers like less than 5 times because I consistently forgot that they were there. It's just, I'm so focused on other stuff that I just couldn't, I didn't have room in my brain for what's going on the lower screen, So to kind of just wrap up like this gameplay section, I know that you as a gamer value action games that provide you with like deep and what's the word, like expressive ways to play. And I mean, you already said this was once your favorite game of all time and that you still love it, but I take it that this at the end of the day gives you that experience that you're looking for.
Yeah, it does. And one last thing I want to say before we wrap up gameplay is, because we accidentally glossed over this earlier and I forgot to call attention to it, but you mentioned selecting difficulty.
Yeah.
The reason why that works the way it does is that every time you die, it forces you to lower the difficulty to continue, which is it is a violent and cruel action towards people like me in particular, which is why I love it so much. Is that it's just this kind of like it's not like cruel in the sense that, oh my God, it's so hard. Because what you do is you bet money to increase your difficulty. And you get a big payout, you get better rewards, you get better loot, you get more money that you can gamble away later, just like gambling in real life. And every time you die, you lose some of that money, and the difficulty is forcibly lowered. I think it's different. If you're playing at like 2.5, I think it only goes down a couple points. But if you're playing at like 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever, it drops by a full point. So like if I'm playing at 7.0 and I die, I lose some hearts, and then it drops down to 6.0, right? Yes, Jack? Mm-hmm. I'm recording, buddy. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Cat content is always
but it's kind of intended to, not only is it as difficult as you want it to be, but also it adds so much risk that if you it's the kind of thing where like if you care about the difficulty, it basically it gives you that danger where like, oh well, if you can't do this in one go, clearly you're not good enough to continue at that difficulty, which is, it kind of adds an element of like, kind of like stress and do or die to it, like a kind of healthy kind of stress that I really love about the game. It makes the action just that much more, intense than it would be otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So then this game does give you that like expressive gameplay that you're after a lot of times then, because like I've already been
it's very thrilling is like the big thing about it is very 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 thrilling and very intense. It's literally in the name. So yeah,
cool. couple other things about gameplay just to touch on real fast before we move on. But at the end of each level, you fight a boss. I can't really comment too much on boss, like if they're difficult or not, or if they, are a proper challenge after going through a level. My impression is that they're more just, story characters that you end up fighting at the end of the level rather than, bosses that have like super unique or memorable mechanics, although like they do have gimmicks and stuff like that. But I will confirm with you, because again, I played the entire game on 2, intensity level 2 out of 9.
Yeah, the bosses, actually, one thing I did literally just like under an hour before we started recording is I went to play the boss rush mode that you unlock, after you beat the game. And the way it works is that it has an easy, normal, and hard setting. It doesn't say, but, you don't bet any money on that one. You just kind of select your difficulty, which thank God. It would suck if you were boss rushing and had to worry about, like, losing hearts every time, because that's a bit harder. But it's easy, normal, and hard. And I'm pretty sure easy is just meant to be intensity 2.0, which, that's the default one. And I played through it, and the bosses are reasonably easier there. Like, there are some where, like, I literally had them over in, like, 10 seconds, but also I was going with, like, an endgame weapon at the base difficulty. Like, the kind of weapons that you're really only going to get if you're playing on, like, the highest intensities. So,
yeah.
It was kind of like... Whereas, like, if you play on, like, the higher intensities, like, they, are a bit harder, they do more damage, they probably have more health, but they are still generally, like, 1 or 2 minute affairs. Like, at least if you're being, aggressive and hitting the target.
Gotcha. Yeah, the boss fights were more entertaining for me because the bosses are almost always, like, characters that you've been dealing with in the story. So if you have enjoyed that character, then you'll enjoy Pit fighting against that character at the end of a level. The banter between them is usually entertaining and stuff like that. But as far as like mechanical gameplay experiences, I have almost nothing to say about these because of the difficulty I was playing on.
I do want to point out that there are 25 chapters. Every single chapter has a boss, and on top of that, with the sole exception of like, I think there's 1 or 2 bosses that are just like, that are like a retooled variant of a previous boss. But aside from that, every single boss is like unique. And I don't mean like unique as in like, oh, well, this one big monster became another big monster with different properties. Like, no, these are all bespoke different bosses. And like in a way that I thought was pretty impressive, especially for like, again, like a handheld game of this scale. Like, they like bigger... Like, just to give you a comparison, like, way bigger action games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta have been prone to reusing bosses over and over again way more than this game does. Or hell, even like, Dark Souls. We know Dark Souls loves to reskin a lot of its bosses sometimes. But like Kid Icarus Uprising, it's like they made like a unique boss for every single chapter in a way that I think is pretty cool, honestly.
Yeah. My one complaint is that most of the bosses, well, since they take place at the end of levels, it's during ground combat sections, and I wanted more rail combat bosses.
Yeah, there are only a few of those.
Many of them. Yeah. In between chapters, after you beat a chapter, you'll go back to this home screen where you can customize your gear. You'll pick up tons of new weapons. You'll pick up new power-ups where you can slot in this little grid. They all have Tetris shapes or variations of that. So you can kind of customize like what bonus effects you want your weapons to have or bonus traits that you want Pit to have. And then you can also mess with the store where you can buy weapons or sell them. And then there is a weapon fusion section too. Now, I'll kind of just briefly touch on my experience with fusing weapons before I get yours. For me, since I'm playing on the lowest difficulty, my only real concern was to make the big number go up when fusing the weapons. I was not really concerned with like, oh, this is going to be a club, it's going to be slow and heavy to swing, or this weapon is shitty at ranged. Because I'm playing on low difficulty, it doesn't matter. Is this something that like, if you want to play at the highest level, you need to really pay attention to?
Yes, you definitely need to like pay attention to both weapon attack ratings and like the various like perks that you get for each weapon. One thing I do want to point out real quick, just a brief touch on the Tetris power selection, is that those don't actually alter your weapon attributes. Those are specifically kind of like Estus style like powers you can use in the game.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So basically, like whenever you select a power that says something like, "Oh, increased defense," that's not like an attribute you're applying to your character. It is a power it is a buff that you can activate while playing the ground sections, and then for a limited time, it'll, make you have high defense, basically.
Okay, so what happened there was let's say I equip this one that adds poison damage to your weapon, and it poisons enemies. That means that instead of being active all the time like I thought it was, I just had randomly hit that power with the touchscreen and activated it.
Yes, that's exactly how it works. Like you haven't played much of this game, so this is going to be lost on you. I'm going to hope that the other 4 people who have played this game catch what I'm about to say, but it's kind of like the consumables in something like Momodora 4, where it kind of follows like Dark Souls Estus rules, where it's like you have a limited set number of uses for each one, and they only refill when you're either done with the stage or when you die, basically. So, like, if you equip the high defense power, depending on whether it's level 1, 2, or 3, because, the higher the level, the bigger the shape is, the harder it is to fit it in the grid, right? It's very much inventory Tetris type stuff. Like, that will determine how big it is. And then if you, say, have a level 1, you might only be able to use it once. If you have a level 3 high defense, you might be able to use it 3 times or 2 times or however much they've decided it works.
Okay, so the fact that I am activating these powers without realizing that that's what I'm doing should show you how much I was flailing with the camera.
Oh, dear.
I was kind of struggling to come up with like a good way to like explain how much trouble I had with this camera.
Oh, goodness.
And then the fact that I'm just wildly activating the powers without realizing that they are activatable and not permanent shows you I'm just like having a hard time. I'm like a caged animal or something like that with that stylus. So
Anyway, so for weapon fusion, like the modifiers and the attack ratings matter. But here's the thing, and this is one thing that I think the game does a poor job of making clear and intuitive to the player, is that when you look at weapons, you have you have 3 major sections to pay attention to, right? You have the weapon's value. You have the weapon's attack rating, those are the star ratings you see for melee and range. So like it can be up to 5 stars for melee and 5 stars for range. And however high it is determines how powerful the melee or range attacks are on that weapon, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have the perks or the modifiers. That's like, typical action RPG stuff, right? Or typical loot game stuff, right? But that's the thing. It is a very distilled loot system, but it is still a loot system, which I thought was pretty interesting because I never thought of it as a loot system until I came back recently after having played games like, Neo, that have that stuff in really unavoidable ways. But the way it works for fusion is that for weapons, you have those three values for the weapon, right? However, here's the thing. Weapon value, since that's the big old 3-digit number usually that's on the screen all times, you as a player are going to most likely think, oh, that's important. That shows how good the weapon is.
Yes.
It does not. It does not.
Fun.
What matters is the attack rating, and if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, the modifiers. Because value only matters if you're playing multiplayer, which I'll barely touch on because I don't play much either, but it only applies to multiplayer, which I'll talk about in a second. But the way fusion works is super short. You have 2 weapons, you can fuse them, you see what they turn into, and it's not going to be like the same weapon. Like you might combine 2 different staffs and then I'll give you a pair of claws or something like that. But there's a lot of back end calculations that are invisible to the player that determine what makes 2 weapons turn into another weapon. And the reason we know it's deterministic is because there are literal Kid Icarus Uprising calculators you can find hidden on the internet that will let you input the weapon values and show you what that will turn into if you're really min-maxing, what you're trying to make.
It reminded me of like fusing personas or something like that in a Persona game where I see the two things going in, I see the result, I understand that there's math going on, but I would never be able to predict what's going to come out. But you don't have to, because it shows you what will happen if, unlike Persona, or maybe Persona 5 does this, it's been a while, it will, if you just hover over the place on the grid where the two weapons intersect, it'll be like, this is what you'll get. And that's, it's helpful.
Yeah, and so you'll always see exactly what you get, but I could not tell you. And I put over 100 hours into this game. I could not tell you what about the two staffs I'm fusing causes the 1.5 attack rating on both of them to suddenly turn into 5 melee and 2 ranged in the new weapon. Like you see all that before you fuse, so you're not doing it blindly. But I do not know what math actually goes into it, and for the different modifiers. But yeah, those are the things you should be paying attention to. You need to be the retake. Those are the things you should be paying attention to when fusing weapons and when choosing what weapons to use in general. You want to pay attention to the attack rating, and you want to pay attention to the modifiers. The value only really matters in multiplayer. There's kind of typical arena multiplayer where you can either play, it's all ground combat, where you can either play free-for-all death matches that are based on your kill-death ratio, or you can play light versus dark, which is the main multiplayer attraction of, not the whole game. Solo is the attraction of the main game, but the multiplayer attraction is light versus dark, where you divide into teams of 3, and you kind of have a team health bar. And every time one of your team members dies, you always come back, but the team health bar goes down. And when it goes down to 0, the last person who died becomes the team angel, which is either Pit or the other Pit that we'll talk about in a little bit. And whichever, if the other team kills that angel, then the match is over. It's kind of like killing the king in chess. Why weapon value matters there is because the higher your weapon value, the more health your team loses when you die.
Okay.
So there's actually a strategic element where, since the value is kind of it is a meticulously calculated value of the weapon based on how good your attack rating is and how good your different modifiers are, right? So if you have a really strong weapon, you're going to dominate the battlefield. It is imbalanced by definition. But if the other team manages to kill you, you could damn near wipe out the entire team health bar in 1 or 2 kills with that. So there's a strategic reason why, if you're getting into light versus dark, why you would want to have a lower value weapon or a less powerful weapon.
Gotcha.
Which is beyond me. I don't really play the multiplayer, and it's mostly dead today, even though you can still play it. But that is an aspect, and that is where value matters. If you're playing the solo mode, you have no reason to pay attention to weapon value. What matters is the content of what the weapon offers.
Well, if I was not playing on difficulty 2 out of 9 for the whole game, I would be upset that the game didn't do a better job to explain that doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's really weird. I feel like they might mention it at some point, but it's in a really easily missable way. It's definitely not one of the things that Palutena barks at you during, gameplay. It's I think it's something that shows up in the menu when you first go there.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So let's get into kind of the wrap up before the spoiler wall here for this episode. Right. So at the end, as we always do, we kind of pick the people that we would recommend this game to. And if we have any kind of thoughts in summary about it. So Moon, I'll start with you. Who would you recommend Kid Icarus Uprising to?
All right. I would recommend it to people who want a thrilling arcade action experience killed with what Masahiro Sakurai himself calls game essence on his YouTube channel, Masahiro Sakurai on Making Games. You should check it out. It's amazing. And it is made up of very short videos, only a couple minutes long. They're subtitled. That man is a gem. I love him. I want him to adopt me. Please go listen to Masahiro Sakurai. He's a very smart man. But anyway, a game essence, which in reality is games with high risk and high reward. Where for the reasons we've discussed before, with the Fiend's Cauldron, difficulty slider, and all that. If you're really into that, you're in for a real treat. If you're a Sakurai stan like I am, this is arguably the most unhinged Sakurai has ever been when making a game. Granted, I've not played Medios. So I can't really judge that. I've not judged Medios on the DS. I hear it's a good puzzle game, but at least of all the other Sakurai games I've played, I'm pretty sure I've played all of them except for the apparently secret games he's developed that his name isn't on, which drives me insane. I can't believe that's a thing. That is a game you'll like. The controls can be an obstacle for some people, but if you can come to grips with them, I think this is like genuinely just a thrilling experience. Even if you're not into the challenge running aspect of it, just a really thrilling and amusing experience from top to bottom. Like, it is a wonderful game, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can definitely like see what you like about it. There was a barrier that I could not get past, especially during those ground combat sections. It was pretty miserable. So like, as far as recommending this to people goes, on 3DS, I don't want to say I don't recommend it to anybody, because someone else who picks it up may not have as much trouble with the camera as I did. In fact, it might be likely that like most people will not find it to be as unplayable as I did. So it's like a very qualified, like, hey, if you think you can handle it, give it a shot. That being said, if you're listening to this in the future and there is a port to the Switch or the Switch 2 or something like that, play this, try it. It's cool. I'm confident that putting this in a more like, I'm not sure how the aiming with the touchscreen and stuff would work if you introduce like, you know, using both hands with a controller and not a stylus. It would be a little bit of a different experience, but I'm still pretty confident that with like a standard control scheme with 2 sticks, this game would be a lot of fun. So if you're listening to this in a magical future place where this is on something not the 3DS, I think you should try it. It's just like, this was a giant struggle for me to get through the game. And luckily it had the lower difficulty things. If it didn't, like if this was like for some reason one of those games that has one difficulty mode, I probably would not have finished the game, just straight up.
Yeah, the one thing I want to add to that, because I meant to mention the possibility of a Switch port in my thoughts, is that some of you, you maybe you do or don't know, you might have found this unavoidable online when it happened, but since Sakurai has multiple times expressed the desire to bring this to Switch, basically, in his videos, like literally just like with a wry smile, it's like, sure would be nice to play this on in HD on the Switch. I wonder if someone will port it. And they does this big shit-eating grin or whatever. And I just want to tell people, like, don't take that as foregone that it's going to come to Switch. I'm not saying that it's impossible, and I will be like the most insufferable fanboy ever if that does get announced. But this, I'll be playing it day one. Like I would pull all stops to play that game and tell everyone about it if it comes to Switch. But it sounds like he's very enthusiastic about it. And the fact that he is just kind of being so coy and saying, oh, it would be so nice if I could bring it to the Switch. The fact that he can say that without Nintendo literally executing him says to me that they're not making it right now. I could be wrong, but the fact that it's not, that he can even say that says to me it's not something that's currently being made. So like, I would not wait on this to come to Switch if that's what you're waiting for. That said, it's a super expensive game right now, and the Nintendo 3DS eShop is shut down. So if you play it, do it via other methods. That's all I'm going to say.
Moon, were you aware that the 3DS is really simple and easy to hack?
Anyone can do it.
By any chance? Anyone can
do it.
Yeah.
It takes literally like 15 minutes.
Anyone can do it. Not saying that you should, but anyone could.
We do not promote piracy behavior on this podcast.
Yeah. So it's a very tentative recommendation. I'm trying not to let my own personal experience like make me assume that other people have the exact same experience that I did. So Moon and I are on kind of different ends of that spectrum here, but I do think there's a good game here. I just couldn't dig into it. Housekeeping before spoiler time. Before I talk about myself, Moon, tell people where they can find your channel and remind them what's going on there. All
right. Thank you, Dave. As I mentioned at the top, you can find me at TripleSMoon basically everywhere. You can find me on YouTube, which is where I do most of my action game content designed to make a newbie-friendly demonstration of action games played at a challenge run or difficult level. You You can find me on Twitter or whatever it's called now. You can find me on Blue Sky if you're there. You can find me on Discord. You can find me on Patreon. If you feel like just donating to support my work on various podcasts and YouTube, you can go there. I do want to emphasize, if you care about action games at all, do consider joining the Discord. It is kind of you'll find a link at basically any of the socials I just listed, where we kind of discuss shop and mechanics about action games, but also it's just like a really good gaming hangout spot too. So if that's something you're interested in at all, consider joining the Discord. Say that Dave sent you, and I'll make sure that he gets a fake cookie that he does not have to use the stylus to eat.
Yeah, I recommend everyone check out the YouTube channel, but I will echo your recommendation for the Discord server. If you like talking about action games, Moon has a good community in there of people who really care about action games. And, I am a casual action game fan, but I do dip in there from time to time to talk about the stuff I'm playing, including finding people to agree with me about Final Fantasy 16 as a little tease for a future episode.
and the server is called The Scoreboard, by the way, with 3 S's. I forgot to say that, but
right.
Yeah. So like if you hit a Discord invite that looks like mine and it takes you to Drill's Discord server that says good chat and son of a bitch chat with no permission to send messages. Real thing, by the way. Adam Bucheri and I were talking about it yesterday. Then you have gone to the wrong server. Make sure it is called The Scoreboard with 3 S's.
All right. So everyone will find links down in the show notes for Moon's YouTube channel, socials, and all of that stuff. Highly recommended. So while I'm talking about myself, you can start clicking around, hit subscribe, and all that fun stuff. So for this podcast, I would really appreciate if people are enjoying the show to tell a friend about it. If you feel so inclined, leaving a rating and review is really helpful. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify especially, leaving a rating and review is awesome. I would appreciate that. If you'd like to support monetarily, I have a Patreon. It is patreon.com/realdavejackson. Minimum $2 per month will get you the ability to vote on polls for what game I should do on the show, get some bonus episodes, and then there's an entire bonus series for people who donate more. Patreon.com/realdavejackson. Any and all support is always appreciated. I also do another podcast called A Top 3 Podcast. That is a very simple show. It is top 3 lists. And if you want to hear me talk about anything that's not video games, that is the place. A Top 3 Podcast. So Moon and I are going to take a break, and when we come back, it is spoiler time for Kid Icarus Uprising. All right, Moon and I are back, and it's time to talk spoilers for Kid Icarus Uprising. This is an interesting one for the spoiler section because, you do go through plot beats as you go. There are some unexpected twists and turns, but this is, not the most spoilable game, in my opinion. There's not a lot of, deeper story themes or anything I need to talk about in this one. Although I do think it's interesting some of the places that you end up going, where you start this game and you think it's Greek mythology. I'm going to be making the rounds through I'm going to do a water level with Poseidon, and I'm going to do a level in Hades and stuff like that. And that, to an extent, that's true, but it goes off the rails at some point where you start, there's fucking aliens and shit in this game, and I didn't expect that. Before we do, though, I want to talk about Dark Pit, who we avoided talking about for some reason in the non-spoiler part. Dark Pit's in Smash Brothers, so I didn't really consider him to be a spoiler, but we haven't talked about him until now. At some point, you meet Dark Pit, early in the game. And Dark Pit is a creation, right?
Dark Pit, basically what happens is that in one of the earlier chapters, you are trying to defeat you're trying to destroy a mirror of, I think it's a mirror of truth is what it was called. And which apparently one of, Medusa's generals, Pandora, is using to kind of like generate monsters, right? And so there's a scene where Pit goes to literally just kind of like flying sidekick the mirror. And as he does so, you get this really cool dramatic shot where he kicks through it, and then opposite of him, Dark Pit comes out. Because he was fractionally too late to stop the mirror from creating a dark version of himself. Dark Pit, he's literally just he's a palette swap of Pit. Instead of everything on Pit that's white is black on Dark Pit. So he has black hair, he has black wings, he has a black tunic, etc. And he's got the same voice actor, Anthony Del Rio, except doing a dark, edgy teenage voice,
That's what I wrote down. I wrote down that Dark Pit is the edgelord version of, like, the regular Pit is like this sweet, young, naive teen, right? Dark Pit is like the teenager that watches rated R movies and is just a general edgelord. He's the goth, everything.
Basically.
Yeah. This sucks. Yeah. What does he matter? This is bullshit.
And so
this is all bullshit.
And the idea of the Mirror of Truth is that it reflects your darkest desires, basically, right? So the idea of Dark Pit is that supposedly he reflects the darkest desires of Pit, essentially. And what's interesting about Dark Pit is that he is explicitly not evil. Like, he gets created, right, and Pandora expects that he's going to fight for her. And literally the first thing he does is he punches, she's like a floating, like, gaseous cloud of fire, basically. But he basically just punches her in the face. And he's like, I don't take orders from you. Like, he frames it like he's, a rebel, basically.
So Pit is such, like I said, he's such a puppy dog that the evil version of Pit is just like kind of a lukewarm edgelord,
that's part of what I'm getting at, is that like Pit is so like inherently and honestly like a good boy that the dark version of himself still ultimately aligns himself with the side of good, even if it's done a little bit more like aloofly, right? And what's interesting about it is that this Dark Pit is you get a couple of rival fights with him throughout the game. They're not as big deal rival fights as, like Devil May Cry or whatever, but you do have multiple fights with him and you do exchange banter when they're going on. And you see that the main thing about Dark Pit is that he doesn't like taking orders. He's no one's pawn. He looks down on Pit because he sees Pit as a puppet for Palutena. Yeah. Dark Pit can fly on his own, by the way. After they defeat Pandora, he steals her powers, and that gives him his own permanent power of flight that doesn't run out. Of course that changes at the end, but that's not important. But
that's a little bit less fun than just saying, "Oh, he's goth, he can fly." All goths can fly.
Well, Pandora, it was a bunch of dark matter, so I'm sure it was pure gothic energy. But he kind of like resents taking orders from anyone. He acts on his own, but he also so conveniently always shows up whenever like things get serious. Like, there are multiple points in the story where things are really about to go poorly for Pit and Palutena, and he shows up to help rescue them or do the right thing, even if he frames it as like, I'm not doing this for you. He's like, later on, he's like, oh yeah, no, we can't let evil things happen. This is horrible. And I think it's kind of interesting because I mentioned at the top, I did this on purpose. Like, I mentioned at the top that Pit is kind of like the hapless mortal against all these gods who are all kind of picking on him. They're kind of jerks to him. Even Palutena is constantly picking on him and like kind of pushing him to do all this dirty work that she doesn't want to do, right? And I really do think that even though Pit is genuinely loyal to Palutena and does care about her and does want to do the right thing. He literally does go through hell and chaos for Palutena later on in the story.
Yeah.
There is a part of him that does resent the fact that he can't fly on his own, the fact that he is joined to Palatena's hip, like he can't do anything without her. He's constantly doing her dirty work. There is a part of him deep inside that genuinely does resent that. And like Dark Pit represents those aspects of him, which I thought was pretty interesting because like, you know, again, like media analysis 101, right? Like this isn't me saying that this is literally canonically exactly what they were thinking. But I do think the read is supported a little bit more strongly than I would have given it credit for when I played 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. You know, there is kind of like, oh, this actually does make sense. This does actually line up with Pitt's personality. It does line up with what we see of him and how the other characters treat him throughout the game. Which I thought was pretty interesting that they represented it, even though they didn't like delve deep on it. It's just kind of like subtext that you can kind of dive into in a way that I would not have expected from a game like this.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I hadn't really... This isn't a story that inspired me to think about the story at all, if I'm being frank. I just kind of like went on the ride from place to place. But I did, you know, take note that the evil version of Pitt is not going to try to take over the world. He's just like, I'm out of here. You all suck, you know? So I mentioned before that you pretty quickly you get, we spoiled the thing about Hades. Again, I didn't think it's a huge spoiler, but you start out the game thinking Medusa is going to be the final villain. You beat Medusa fairly early in the game, and then it turns out Hades is the big bad. And for a while, that's your antagonist. But in the middle section of the game, you do fight alongside Hades as these aliens attack the Earth, which I think is interesting whenever you're like, oh, this is the villain, but now there's an even greater villain. So we're teaming up basically. And they bicker back and forth. Like the angels, I forget what they're called.
The forces of nature.
The other person.
Basically there's Palatena's just like, I guess, warriors of light, basically.
Warriors of light. The forces of nature.
There's a Veridi who's this kind of, she's like a little 6-year-old girl, you know, who I'm sure is thousands of years old, like who she resents humans and kind of wants to wipe them out so that nature can return to its natural state. And then there's Hades with the forces
every time,
the dark world,
every time Veridi was like, humans, you've been fucking up the planet. Humans have to go. I'm like, yeah, I know. Like of all the people who are like, we have to kill all the humans, I'm like, the forces of nature have a beef, you know?
Yeah, I will say Veridi is actually one of my favorite characters in the game, too. I think she's genuinely pretty fun.
She's fun,
but but what they do is that in the game is after Hades gets introduced, they kind of go out of their way to introduce the fact that there are 3 different factions. There's Hades, there's Team Hades, there's Team Veridi, and there's Team Palatena, basically. And, you know, they're kind of all bickering and all of them kind of want to stop each other because, you know, Palatena wants to stop both Hades and Veridi from, you know, essentially destroying the world in their own ways. And Veridi thinks that, Hades is too far because he just kind of wants to destroy everything for selfish gain. He's like, no. I just want to kill people. I don't want to kill everyone else, you know, so she has beef with Hades as well. And then when the aliens attack, the Aurum is what they're called. Mm-hmm. You know, they kind of have to all team up to stop, you know, the aliens for a bit. And, you know, that's kind of its own self-contained story in the middle that leads on to the final act of the game.
Yeah.
After that.
It does take a kind of interesting twist in the middle because after the aliens attack, this is in chapter 18 I wrote down.
Yes.
You lose basically, and then Pitt wakes up 3 years later. And it's this weird little gameplay section where you're controlling different things that Pitt's consciousness is stuck inside of. Or Pitt's consciousness is in a ring, and whoever has the ring, Pitt can control their body. So you control a little girl running around, and then a dog, and then this big warrior character named Magnus, which is a great name.
He's a guts.
I once named a dog Magnus because it's a great name. Ooh. And then you fight Pitt's body, and you put the ring on Pitt's body to get his consciousness back inside. And so you think like, okay, now we're going to get the gang back together. It's chapter 18. I looked on the wiki. There's 25 chapters, but Palatena has gone crazy. And so like, it's just like a bunch of unexpected sequences of events, you know, that just kind of keep this thrill ride going basically. But I do want to give it credit that when you take a closer look at the characters and what their role is and how they interact with each other, I do think that it's coherent. The characters all make sense. What they're doing makes sense. How they feel about the situations that they're in. All of that stuff makes sense too. So like, I experience this as, now we're fighting the force of Medusa. Oh shit, it's Hades. Oh shit, Viridi wants to drop bombs on the earth to kill all the people. Oh fuck, it's aliens. That's like my train of thought going through the story. But you're right, like the characters I think are pretty good, pretty well realized, we'll say.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting about this whole chapter 18 is probably one of the more just like interesting chapters, because that's where things get so trippy and all. Like, you start with that kind of like, and these are explicitly non-combat sequences, by the way, where like first you're a little girl, then you're a dog. It doesn't have combat again until you control Magnus, who, right, by the way, is a character you meet much earlier, but he's not super important, so we didn't really mention him.
Yeah, he's just brought him up because I think the name is cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And, he's a guts, basically. He's a big, brawny guy with a tan who, he talks like this, and, he's got a big old fuck off sword.
Yeah.
But the other interesting turning point about this is that, we find out Palutena goes crazy because she's under some kind of influence. And during this section, this lasts for like maybe 3 or 4 chapters, Viridi becomes the main goddess who's guiding you. Because she comes up, she gives Pit the power of flight, and then she's like firmly on your side at this point. Like she still bickers with you and, other characters a lot, but she is firmly a good guy from this point up until the end of the game, basically. And then, what ends up happening is that you have to fight Palutena, and you find out that earlier in the game, when you were at war with Viridi, Pit and Palutena accidentally unleashed an evil beast called the Chaoskin that was being hidden in a prison. And the Chaoskin basically took over Palutena's mind and caused Palutena to turn Pit into a ring, and now she's kind of at war with the humans and wants to destroy everyone. And for some reason, I guess Viridi, there's a part of her that has a soft side for Pit and Palutena, so that's why she's helping them, even though Palutena is literally on her side with destroying humans, essentially.
Right, yeah.
And, you kind of fight Palutena, you free her from the Chaoskin, the Chaoskin eats her soul, and then you and Dark Pit jump into the Chaos Dimension to fight the Chaoskin, and it's just this big spectacle. There's a really fun part where Pit and Dark Pit recite a motto, kind of like Team Rocket, while they're fighting everyone. And they've never rehearsed this before. They just, I guess because they're two sides of the same coin, they just know they know what they're gonna say. And, and then after that, but by the way, they kind of recycle these ideas in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Like they do have like this similar aesthetic with like evil chaos monsters and stuff in the story mode for that game. But after that, you kind of get back to fighting Hades, where it's like Viridi and Palutena and Pit and Dark Pit all after Hades, because Pit. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this party. Dark Pit almost gets killed by the Chaoskin, and Pit begs Viridi to activate the power of flight, which he already used up to save him, and the result is Pit's wings burn up and he almost dies. You get one little chapter where Dark Pit goes to the rewind spring to restore Pit, and that's a little diversion. You get to see Pandora again, and she gets hot, like, because of course she does. But after that, it's just a couple more chapters where you're fighting Hades again, where it's the shortest arc in the game. It's like, you try to fight Hades and he destroys the special armor that Pit had, and then you have to go find new armor, and the new armor is a mech, and you have to face 3 challenges. I'm pretty sure that's something from Greek myth. Like you have to get the armor, and then you have to go fight Hades again, and that's basically where the finale of the game takes place, where you destroy Hades once and for all as Pit.
I will say that the trials that you have to do are like really long ground combat levels.
That chapter was a bit long.
I hated that so much. Because again, I'm in, what is it, like chapter 23 of the game?
It's chapter 24.
24, and I'm still like having such a hard time with the ground combat that like earlier chapters, it's like, 5 minutes of flying, 5 to 10 minutes of ground combat. And then this one was like fucking a half hour of ground combat. And I was like, this sucks. Let me finish this.
Yeah. And like the other thing to mention about it is that it is explicitly a boss rush chapter.
Uh-huh.
Now, Kid Icarus Uprising, thankfully, it does this twice. It also does a boss rush in Chapter 9 when you're going to kill Medusa. But thankfully, it's only like a few bosses. It's like 3 or 4 bosses or something like that. And at least a couple of them are semi-unique, like they are variations of previous bosses. But it does kind of go on. And if you're not down with the ground combat, fighting a bunch of bosses in a row doesn't sound particularly appealing.
Yeah. What was cool, though, is that the final boss is a flying boss fight.
It is all flying.
Yeah. And when that happened, I was like, holy shit, something for Dave.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. It's spectacle more than anything else. I don't think it's I'm pretty sure it's not even remotely the hardest stage in the game. In fact, I think on my old save file, I think that was actually one of the first chapters I did an Intensity 9 run on back in the day. Mm-hmm. So it's more about spectacle than anything else. But you get this kind of like literally 5-stage fight against Hades. All of it is flying. It doesn't sound, it's not as intimidating as it sounds. When I say 5 stages, it's not like, like a 5-phase boss fight like in, Bloodborne or Elden Ring or whatever. It's like, no. It's like, they're pretty sure they all iterate on the same idea. It is you flying around and shooting,
shooting weak
just
spots.
With like different patterns.
Yeah.
Huh?
Just shooting weak spots as you fly around.
Yeah, shooting different weak spots. There's a different gimmick in each one. It's kind of fun because Hades is giant, and you're in your mech or your flying mech that changes forms multiple times. Like you get all like the real like anime as fuck stuff where like Hades cuts the mech in half and that causes the mech to transform into a new shape and it's not done, and that's pretty cool. And
yeah,
it's just a whole lot of spectacle, and it's really fun. And I can't end this without calling out Hades as just like a really fun just a really fun voice casting throughout this game. Yeah. Like he does this amazing, really flamboyant version of Hades, and like, which is kind of funny because you think of, when you hear of flamboyant Hades, you think of like Disney's Hades, who was also pretty flamboyant, but this is like a cut above that. He is hamming up and chewing every single scene he's in a way that I thought was pretty amusing.
Yeah, I was just looking at it's Scott Bullock. I was looking at his voice credits, and he's got a Monkey Island game on here, which just thinking about the way voice acting goes in Monkey Island and the way this performance is, like, yeah, he'll fit right in that game. But yeah, also in God Hand, second God Hand reference of this podcast here today. Check. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a really fun performance. And I said that they went to that style of voice too many times, but it's not like his fault that's the way it is. He did a really good job. So props to him. Super charismatic performance for sure.
Yeah.
After you beat Hades at the end, you go through the credit sequence, and this is notable because as a Super Smash Brothers fan, when the credits started and you can like shoot at the stuff during the credits, like the names and stuff like that, I was like, hell yeah, this is I always love that so much after beating like the adventure mode in Smash,
Yeah, it's really fun. You can shoot all the credits. I almost got 100% of the credits this time, but then one of the new kittens, Jack, got in the way, and I didn't have the heart to bat him out of the way, so I ended up missing some of the credits.
Yeah.
But I don't think you get anything for it. There is a kind of weird like little achievement hunt thing in the game that's pretty fun, like kind of like the one that's in Kirby Air Ride, but it's just kind of for fun.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And shout out to Jack. So that is Kid Icarus Uprising. It's a pretty lean spoiler section this time, but it's not a game that the story was the thing I was most excited to talk about. I think that this is gameplay, spectacle, visuals, and music, of course, above story. Although we did find some little interesting nuggets to dig into here. So Moon, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Dave. I'm always happy to be on here. It's been a long time since we've had a solo recording too.
It has been, yeah.
literally since the first Death's Gambit episode that we did.
That's right.
Then,
Yeah. Not to take anything away from Bloodborne or talking about emergent gameplay and stuff, but of course, good to have you back on. And like, little behind the scenes for everybody, we've been talking about making this particular episode happen for a while, and then I was like, you know what, I want to play something on 3DS, need something a little bit shorter, let's do it. So this has been great. I appreciate your expertise. As I have mentioned before, this is not a game where I could really dig into the gameplay the way that I normally like to, so good to have you here for sure.
Well, thank you. I did my best.
So another recommendation at the end for everyone to check out Moon's YouTube channel, TripleSMoon, the word triple, S, and Moon. Good stuff. If you like action games, you'll find something to like there.
Please join Dave's Discord. I don't think he mentioned that, but the Tube Discord is also really, really cool.
Thank you.
Like I don't think Dave mentioned that. I wanted to mention it earlier, but I didn't find a slot to do so. But definitely join the Tube Discord server. It's really fun. Tons of different channels for different types of media. Real gaming focus. There's a fun gaming log channel where whenever you beat a game, you can post a tweet length review of it and not talk there. I break the rule about the length of the review all the time. Do not be like me. If you do, then Dave will force you to podcast with him, which is why I'm here.
Yeah, this is your penance. If you have that much to say where you can't condense it down to a tweet, then that's your punishment. Yeah, I appreciate the plug. I totally forgot to plug the Discord server, which is fine. I plug it on every other episode. But yeah, I agree. It's a great place, and we would love to have you in the community there. So other than that, all that's left to say is to thank everybody who's listened to the end. We appreciate you very much, and tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.
Thanks, y'all.